Welcome everybody to Solo Ship Week 11. We're getting through the season, Week 11 already. It seems like every week the slate just gets uglier. It seems like there's less games, like more injuries, like more teams like on the primetime games that would be good offenses. And I do think, yes, we've had some, it's just natural. Like injury news is going to get more kind of murkier as the season goes on. It seems like NFL becomes more like NBA as the season goes on, where we're waiting, a lot more game time decisions that are impactful to the slate. But it's also like scoring is down. Like I looked up, 3 years ago or 2020, I think we had 5 teams at 30 points or more. This season we have none, and the one team that's at exactly 30 points per game is off the slate, Kansas City. So the slates feel uglier, but then we've got a little bit of a shift with this week. We got the Bills now going to a dome as long as they can get to Detroit out of Buffalo.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Playing on Sunday. So yeah, what are your thoughts? How was your week?
Yeah, the scoring is down, and then people look for like macro trends, right? People always want to be like, so what's changed? And it's like, well, we can go team by team and see like how these teams are playing offense or what these matchups are lining up as. Like it's just like a lot of teams that are still developing their offenses that are like playing defense heavy, like the Jets, the Giants, the Bears, like or not the Bears, the Cowboys, like they're leaning on their defense to win games, and a lot more teams are skewing run heavy. And so it's just kind of like it's a lot of micro situations that are leading up to a macro that has scoring down across the league. And I think that people are then next year, they're gonna be like, oh, scoring's down, and then next year could be totally different, right? Every year is so different. But then in addition to the lower score, I mean, when was the last time we saw an over-under on the main slate of like 55, right? We used to see those every week. And so in addition to scoring being down, we're at this point, I talked about this like a month ago, when we had all like teams have moved away from the workhorse running back by and large. And so we had all these high-price running backs who had like 65 to 70% rolls. And I was highlighting like, here's all these guys in the 5K to 6K range who also have 65, 70% rolls. But because pricing psychology tells us these high price guys are the best plays, like these low price guys were coming in lower on than they should have. And I was saying at the time, like play these low owned guys, get your upside at wide receiver, and then like recognize that within a few weeks, these good prices are going to be gone, and then we'll have really tough decisions to make. And we're at that point now. It's like, last week Dameon Pierce was chalk, not because people wanted to play him, but just because he was the only guy under 7K who made any sense at all, right? And then this week, David Montgomery, 6,100, similar thing. Dameon Pierce is apparently popping as chalk again at 6,500 against the number 2 run defense by DVOA on an offense that doesn't score touchdowns. And so, yeah, it's like pricing. We're in this like later season part where pricing's really tight. And one of the things I think is interesting about this slate, when I started doing some practice builds on Tuesday night, I spent like an hour and a half messing around with stuff before I built a single practice roster. I was like, I literally don't know what to do here. And then by the time I came back to things on Wednesday night, I started just asking myself on every player, can this guy win me a tournament, right? Not like, what does this guy project at and what's his median range of outcomes, and not is this guy safe, but like, does this guy have ceiling? And when we started asking that question, this slate becomes a lot more interesting because there are players across all the price ranges that you could say, oh, this guy could win me a tournament. This guy could win me a tournament. So it's a week where like, if your roster misses, it's going to miss hard. You're going to have like sub 100 points. But if it hits, right, like I think a lot of people are going to have rosters that score 160, 170. There's not a lot of guys capable of scoring 30 points this week. Not a lot of guys capable of going 4x their salary. So if you're just focusing on ceiling and you get the right guys on the right roster, like I think there's a clear path to first place this week that a lot of people are going to be missing because people want that feeling of certainty when they're looking at things.
Yeah, it's a pretty similar week to what we talked about last week, where there's certain guys popping. Like, yeah, Dameon Pierce is going to pop because there's certainty there. Although I'd actually argue with Benjamin, maybe there's even less certainty than people are thinking, because they must have signed him for a reason, and he was kind of like highly regarded at least by the fans in Arizona. Like look on Twitter, like it seemed like Benjamin fans were waiting for him to take over from James Conner, and then he was surprisingly released. So we don't know what happened there, but yeah, Houston put in a waiver claim. So and they presumably put in the waiver claim because they see him as a good young player could be part of the future. So yeah, there's probably even less certainty with Dameon Pierce than people are thinking. It's just when you look at projections, or if you aggregate projections, you're going to get a lot of Dameon Pierce, a lot of David Montgomery, particularly on FanDuel. He's got a pretty good FanDuel price, I think, David Montgomery. But like that certainty doesn't buy you a whole lot once the games kick off, right? Because then then it's all about upside. And we talked about last week, looking for guys in different roles, and it didn't work out for me, or it didn't work out for anybody unless you had a lot of Justin Fields, on your roster. I guess Jonathan Taylor as well, which was a good call by you last week. Yeah. So yeah, it is. I think it's all about the upside, and a lot of times, as the season goes on, it feels like the pricing gets tighter. It does, but it gets tighter because you have a frame of reference to look back on, which is the whole season, right? Like the whole part of the season up to now. So we look and say, well, these guys are all like efficiently priced now because we're looking at their seasonal averages, or just not even computing a seasonal average, just looking at their game log. It's like, well, yeah, they're priced about where they should be, considering, but you're expecting them to perform as they have their average, so far this season. And that's not the way it's going to play out, right? It's going to be some guy that scores 2-3 touchdowns that we're not expecting. So it's about hunting, I think, for that upside, and just embracing the uncertainty and having to live with the idea that I don't know how this guy's going to perform, but I'm hunting for that upside.
Yeah, and this is why when you put in one of the things I've been doing a lot lately is running a lot of optimizer builds just to get a sense of like what optimizers are going to spit out for the field and for 150 max players, and like for content providers, right? Like that, how are people seeing to put together a slate? And when you run like a set of rosters with just median projections, a guy like Damon Pierce is going to pop. When you run it with ceiling projections, those guys don't get put in there, right? Because like that extra 1,200 to get up to like Mixon or Josh Jacobs, or these guys who can actually score 30 plus points, like it's worth it to save 1,200 somewhere else where there's uncertainty. If you're spending like 5.3K on a wide receiver or 4.3K on a wide receiver, you're still taking on a lot of uncertainty, especially on a week like this. And so like I will have, and this is, I said this on the Overzet show too, like this is not to say that this guy can't hit. He can, but I will have 0% Damon Pierce this week. On 150 rosters, I will not have him a single time, because it's like, what are the chances that he puts up a score that buries me for not having had him? And then what are the chances on the flip side that he puts up like 13, 14, 15, 16 points at 6.5K in salary and hurts everybody who rostered him? So yeah, I went from being like, ooh, this is an ugly week, to kind of where I was 2 weeks ago, whatever that was, week 9, when I didn't really perceive it as being an ugly week until people started saying ugly week. And I was like, oh, really? Like I've got Justin Fields over here at 5,300 and like whatever else I like that week. And that's kind of like, I've kind of moved to that state for this week, which is funny because on Tuesday night, I was like, I don't know what to do. I have no idea what to do here. And now by this point in the week, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess this is an ugly slate to most people. But to me, it's just like, no, I see like how you can build tournament winning rosters on this slate.
So we do have 3 games, I think, that are about 49.5. Or I guess the Atlanta-Chicago game is 49.5. And now the Bills and Detroit are 49.5. I know like the Minnesota-Dallas game was also up there. Like I think it's the third highest total of the game of the week. 48 looks like 48.5. So we do actually have some places where we can find some offense, but I think there's some flaws with each of those games.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys laid it out great 1 week season. The Chicago Atlanta game is just two teams that are going to run the ball. So maybe that game has the highest floor for offense, but it's not a place where we're necessarily going to see seeing them throw the ball over the ending drives very quickly. So it might not be the best DFS spot, although certainly for single entry, maybe it's some place you want to look. I'm probably going to end up under the field on Justin Fields again. It's probably going to bury me. But he's expensive. He's gotten more expensive as this little run has gone on. So yeah, like you were saying, like 5,300 a few weeks ago. I think now he's like the third most expensive quarterback on the slate.
Yeah, and like what we said last week was, and I played Fields last week, but I was underweight on Fields, right? Like we know what he's capable of, but also it's important to note, like when we see this happen, especially back-to-back weeks, we start perceiving it as like, oh, this is going to keep happening, right? And so I want to highlight, like he's had 6 rushing touchdowns all season, and 5 of them have come in his last 4 games, right? He's not going to keep scoring a rushing touchdown per game. He's had back-to-back games of 140 plus rushing yards. It's like when Josh Jacobs went for 140 plus rushing yards in 3 straight games. And it's just like, oh, this guy's going to keep doing it. And then it stops happening. And you realize, oh, yeah, that's kind of unrealistic. They were just bunched up. I think it was 2018, maybe it was 2019. I think it was 2018 in his rookie year that Josh Allen he was the first quarterback in NFL history to rush for 100 yards in, I think it was 3 consecutive games. And then he had another game with like 99 yards. So he almost hit 4 consecutive games. And it shows how rare it is to rush for 100 yards like in consecutive games, right? The rushing records are still like barely 2,000 yards for running backs. And that's like averaging just over 100 yards per game. Like, so there's going to be a game where Fields rushes for 80 yards. And then if we're talking DraftKings, that takes away the 100-yard bonus, which is 3 points right there. That takes away, which is almost like a full passing touchdown, right? And then that takes away like the extra 60, 70, 80 yards that he's getting there. So that's like 10, 12, 13 points he loses. And if he doesn't get that and doesn't get the rushing touchdown, well, now he's at a 20, 22, 23, 24-point score. So I think it's like I'll have Fields this week, but he's not a guy. I don't think I'll have him on my single entry. And he's not a guy who I'm like going out of my way to say I got to start with Fields, because I recognize what his ceiling is, but I also recognize that he can put up a Lamar Jackson type score. And like Lamar Jackson's only topped 23.1 points 5 times since the start of last year, right? Like, and yet we know what his ceiling is. It can be the same thing with Justin Fields. Like, he can come out, have a great game, position the Bears for touchdowns, but not get the rushing touchdowns himself, not top 100 yards. And all of a sudden people are like, how do they only get – I saw Justin Fields break off a bunch of long runs. How did they only get 23 points from this guy? It's like, well, that's the way that the math works on his scoring.
Yeah. And so it's very reminiscent of Lamar Jackson. And I've seen this with Lamar Jackson, that when he hits, he can hit big. I mean, you don't see quarterbacks score 45 points. I mean, that's tremendous. And then, but it's not going to be that way every week. Like, if he doesn't get multiple rushing touchdowns, then he's putting up kind of an average score. And so it's a big difference. Like 25 points when he's 5,300, that can still win you a tournament. When it's 25 points and he's 7,600, that's probably not good enough anymore. Because there probably is going to be some quarterback that exceeds him. And even if that quarterback's like 7,400 or 7,800, and that quarterback gets 30 points, suddenly that's the quarterback that's on the winning roster. I actually did just notice that Marcus Mariota is at 5,300, which is actually interesting. He's not somebody that had really been on my radar until I was just looking up the pricing. I don't know. What do you think about like Mariota? Like, I mean, he's probably not going to pass the ball, but I mean, I don't know. It's the same game, same total. I don't know. Mariota just occurred to me right now as we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, he's right now he's sitting at like the highest projected ownership if you look at like aggregate ownership, I think. So he's certainly not going to be like overlooked in this game environment. But I think here's like the way I would typically look at Mariota is, even if he has like a ceiling game, he probably doesn't go above 24, 25 points, right? So then I'd be like, well, that like I still want a quarterback who can get me 30. But then when you look at the state of this week, and it's like, well, 25 points might actually get, like, I'll say it like this. I don't think Jalen Hurts tops 30 points this week in a really like tough spot against an Indy defense that was almost designed to stop a player like him, right? I think he'll still have a good game, but it's not like he's been popping off for 30-point scores left and right? Like, he needs a lot of things to go right. What is he? He's got 22.8 last week, 21 the week before, 28.4 the week before, 16.9, 27.7, 17.0. So it's not going out on a limb to say he probably doesn't top 30 at this really high price tag. I'm also 100% off Lamar Jackson this week, because we tend to look at him as like, man, this guy can pop anytime for these monster games. But since the start of last year, you alluded to like how high he can score. So yeah, all 5 times he's gone over 23.1 points, he's smashed. All 5 times that he's gone over 23.1 points, he scored 35 or more. He scored 40 plus in 3 of those games. But all of those were high scoring back and forth games. One of those games, it was a final total of 56 points. The other 4 games were all 60 plus points. One of them was 70 plus points. One of them was 80 points. And so it's not like in this game environment with Gus Edwards on the field where they tend to run the ball more, like we should expect Lamar Jackson to just suddenly pop for a huge game. And so he can, but he's a guy who I'm comfortable saying, you know what, the field's probably going to be on like 6 to 8%. And he probably gets you the typical like 23, 24 points. So if we're looking at all these high priced guys and we're like, maybe none of them hit 30 points. Well, Mariota's 25 points then become really valuable. So yeah, I don't love the fact that this is going to be kind of a popular play and that it doesn't really have that high of a ceiling. But then when you look at the state of the slate, it's like, it's actually pretty sharp. So Mariota is one of the guys kind of on my condensed list. I'll throw this one to you too. I bet you'll like this one for a condensed list for like build 5 single entry rosters and put this on one of them. Joe Burrow. And I'm like thinking about who's the guy who on Sunday night, people are going to be like, why did none of us roster this guy? Right. Like obviously Joe Burrow could disappoint but it's like, we have this 2-game sample size and no Jamar Chase and people are just like, oh, they don't do well through the air without Jamar Chase. But it's like, yeah, in 2 games, but would it shock us against a Steelers defense that's allowed like second most wide receiver yards, the most wide receiver touchdowns? Would it shock us if Burrow comes out and has a good game? So I think that Burrow's range of outcomes is broad. I think that he could end up 16 points, 17 points. But from a standpoint of who might we on Sunday night be like, whoa, how did we miss that guy? I think Burrow is one of those guys. And so I think he's super interesting this week at 6,800.
Yeah, actually, I'd kind of forgotten that Pittsburgh was on the slate. It's because it's a 40-point total. Yeah, I mean, Cincinnati's favored by 3.5, 4 on the road. Joe Burrow is not a guy that you're going to be surprised at the end of the slate. Like, yeah, of course. Like, why wasn't I looking at Joe Burrow? He had 3-4 passing touchdowns, but he's not on the radar for the slate. I think the one thing we should probably talk about that's really shaking up the slate a little bit is the Buffalo game getting moved to Detroit. Buffalo Cleveland game being played in Detroit because of the blizzard in Buffalo. As long as they can get there by Sunday, I guess they're going to be playing. And I think Josh Allen's going to end up being my highest owned quarterback, just because now suddenly they're in a dome. That's one of the highest point total games on the slate now, 49.5. And I don't know by Sunday if there'll really be any like residual benefits, like ownership benefits, from the fact that the game started with a really low total when it was in Buffalo. And I'm going to tell myself that right now, that like people aren't going to be on it because because the game started off with like a 42-point total, or 43-point total. But still, I think people might be off Josh Allen just based off of recent performance, some injury concerns, but he's not on the injury report this week, so that's a benefit. And I think he's played well enough where it's not like a major concern, especially if he's getting healthier each week.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking like taking on a little bit of risk to access some ceiling, I'll take on a little bit of risk of like Josh Allen recent performance for sure. Yeah, I don't think that I mean, I'm with you on like the low total to start the week won't necessarily influence ownership, but I do think like all this uncertainty around this game, because on Friday, Saturday, people want to start being like, okay, I'm going to play this guy. I'm definitely going to go here. I'm definitely going to go here. So it's easy for people to be like, well, I don't have to worry about Josh Allen because I've got Lamar Jackson here. I've got Justin Fields here. So I do think that he'll go lower own, and the fact that he's higher priced than those guys, people will be like, well, why would I worry about that if I can just take Justin Fields, if I can just take this guy, if I can just take this guy. So I think we'll get lower ownership than we should get on Allen and Diggs. I think that we always get lower ownership than we should get on Gabe Davis. Before I realized like how bad that snowstorm was supposed to be, I was kind of hoping that it would stay in Buffalo, because on those fields, those snowy fields where it's harder to cut, I was like, dude, Gabe Davis could act like he's breaking in and get the cornerback to shift their hips and then just go. It would be so hard to catch up to him, and he could have a monster game. But even in the dome against Cleveland, I like Gabe Davis in tournaments this week as a one-off paired with Josh Allen. I like the Josh Allen Stephon Diggs pairing. So yeah, that's one that I will be overweight the field on. You mentioned before the show that somebody had asked in the comments last week if we could drop in our like favorite stack for single entry. And like at the end of the show, and my first thought was, well, that's the one that like I'll drop in because that's what I'm likeliest to gravitate toward for single builds is that one, just because I think that, when you do it, you're like, oh, well, this is a great play, but it's just like other people are kind of like Kirk Cousins is going to be chalky this week, and Dak Prescott, who we typically don't love to go out of our way to play, and Lamar Jackson where he's supposed to blow out the opponent, and Justin Fields at this high price. Like, it's like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you play Josh Allen at lower ownership for just a few $100 more?
I don't know if he's really going to be that low owned by the time they rolls around now. I was looking at the RotoGrinders ownership projections. I think we have him less than 5% owned. Like, there's no way that's going to. Josh Allen's playing in the highest total game of the week. Like, that people are going to roster him, and that I think that's going to shake up the ownership projections. It's like, I don't think Marcus Mariota is, like you said, he's one of the highest, if you aggregate like ownership projections, one of the higher projected owned quarterbacks. Like, I don't think people are going to own him that much. So I think we're going to see a lot of shifting in the ownership projections. So I think people are going to end up spending up a little bit at quarterback. One thing, I like the idea of embracing the uncertainty and embracing the uncertainty with cheaper players. I haven't figured out like what the value pieces are going to be, but like at running back, I actually was toying around just before the show with locking in Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, and Nick Chubb, and seeing what that got me. And part of it was this thought that there's less scoring right this year, so the touchdowns are more important. As you know, who's got the best touchdown odds? Like just Vegas, anytime touchdown odds, it's Nick Chubb and Saquon Barkley. And I don't think those guys are going to be that high owned. And they're like, I hate playing Nick Chubb because he doesn't catch passes. But I like the idea of maybe like a single end for the roster. I'm just taking Chubb, Josh Allen, and Stephon Diggs, and hope that they're lower owned, and just seeing what else. Like you get like a decent roster if you plug those guys in, and then you get value pieces that maybe you wouldn't be high on. But if they kind of get forced in there, and they have just as much a chance of hitting as anything else on kind of an ugly week for value.
Yeah, I mean, I think nobody ever likes playing Nick Chubb, right? So he kind of always comes in low owned, and again, it's one of these weeks where like I played around with Antonio Gibson plus Brian Robinson, and it was like they're 10.9K in combined salary, and you're like, can they even get above like 35 or 40 points? No, probably not. But then you realize, well, they save you a lot of salary at running back, and you look at all the 6K running backs. Do any of them get you 4X? Probably not. You look at the 7K running backs, maybe Josh Jacobs, maybe Joe Mixon, but they can also finish way below that. You look at like, is Saquon getting you 4X? Probably not, right? So it's an interesting week in which like 3.5X at running back on a cheap running back who frees you up to go elsewhere is pretty valuable. Or like a high price running back who even just hits that 4X becomes pretty valuable. I don't think there will be that many 30-point scores on this slate across the board. So if Nick Chubb ends up getting his 30-pointer, that typically we'd be like, yeah, that's fine, but we spent all the salary in him and we would really love like a 40-pointer. Like now on this particular week, the unique setup of this slate, those 30 points become really valuable, whereas typically they're not that valuable. And I don't think people will make that shift. That's actually one that I hadn't thought of myself. And so I like that. And I also like one of the pairings that I've highlighted this week, because value is really thin. So one of the pairings I've highlighted this week is two of the pairings, actually, I'll say this, Justin Jefferson plus CeeDee Lamb and Saquon Barkley plus Amon-Ra St. Brown. All four of those guys will be popular, but because of the combined price tags on them, it's so difficult to build around them. And so I think people who kind of like, oh, I'd love to get Jefferson plus CeeDee Lamb, and they start trying to build that, and they're like, I can't build a good roster of this, and they'll do something different, right? They'll put in Schultz, or they'll put in like somebody different on the Vikings. They'll put in Hawkinson, whatever it is. And so similarly with the Allen plus Diggs plus Chubb, anybody who has that idea, they start with it, and then they're like, well, I can't actually build this roster in a way that I like it. And so in addition to people not wanting to roster Chubb, we'll get really low like combinatorial ownership on that, because combining all those price tags together just makes it really tough this week. And we love finding stuff like that, because now you've got one bet that if it hits, you're way ahead of everybody, because people just can't build that roster themselves.
Yeah, that's the third game. That is the higher point total game is the Dallas Minnesota game. I'm actually surprised, like just looking at the ownership projections, that it's not like the pieces aren't as highly owned as I would expect. I think part of that might be some uncertainty with the Dallas running back situation. I don't know if you saw anything right before we came on about Ezekiel Elliott. I think he's still listed as questionable. That was something that kind of shook up the slate a little bit last week. It looked like Elliott was going to be out, and Pollard ended up being pretty highly owned. You saw the plan for like Tony Pollard being the only running back in Dallas. But I think that's an interesting game. I think that's a really interesting pairing that you bring up. I think CeeDee Lamb is definitely popping for a lot of people in optimals, and I think he's up there in terms of the ownership projections. But that makes it difficult to then put in Justin Jefferson. Like you're not seeing, if you run just like an optimizer for any set of projections or aggregate projections, you're going to get a lot of CeeDee Lamb. You're not getting a lot of Justin Jefferson because he's too expensive. And CeeDee Lamb is showing us the better value, and then that optimizers are pairing him with other good values. But that's probably not what you want to do. What you want to do is take, if CeeDee Lamb's getting pushed for his ceiling score, it's probably coming from Justin Jefferson, or maybe like Dalvin Cook. Like maybe that's an interesting pairing as well.
Yeah, that's another really interesting pairing that'll be low, like a lot lower on. And yeah, like Mike McCarthy has talked about, like our goal is to get our, if Zeke's playing, which Jerry Jones has said he will be. Jerry Jones said defenses know how important Ezekiel Elliott is to the team, which is like him trying to convince fans and fantasy analysts, like, no, guys, Ezekiel Elliott's really important. Defenses think so. Not true. But if Zeke is playing, Mike McCarthy has said like their goal is to get 30 running back carries between those two guys. They feel like they'll win games every time they get 30 running back carries between those two guys. And so in order for CeeDee Lamb to really pop, he needs to be in a game environment where the Cowboys are like, hey, there's points being scored. We got to throw the ball. We got to react here. And so like CeeDee Lamb at 7,500 without a Vikings piece just doesn't make that much sense to me. CeeDee Lamb with a Vikings piece, it's like, well, this is telling a story where like the type of game environment where CeeDee Lamb would actually be getting a tournament winning score. Now you're actually betting on that type of game environment. And then, yeah, like the fact that, like you said, optimizers aren't putting Justin Jefferson in there because it's like, yeah, he's a great play, but with the way pricing works out this week, you probably can't fit these guys and build the type of roster that the optimizer wants to build. And so we'll just get lower combined ownership there. Same thing, like you said, Dalvin Cook with CeeDee Lamb, another really interesting one to consider.
Yeah, I think it's shaping up as a week where, I'm always going to do game stacking, but I do think I'm probably going to end up concentrating on these three games that we've talked about that have the higher point totals, probably the least on the Chicago-Atlanta games. Because I think Justin Fields is going to end up a little bit overowned, just based off of his recent performance. And even if I'm playing Fields, I don't know that I necessarily need to bring him along with a bunch of pieces from that game. I think Drake London is getting some attention, and I probably will have him. I think he's generally more attractively priced on FanDuel than on DraftKings. So maybe I'll have some like Fields, Drake London stacks, or maybe end up with some Mariota. And I'm probably going to end up focusing on the Buffalo. I keep wanting to say it's the Buffalo Lions game, but it's Buffalo, Cleveland in Detroit. And then the Dallas-Minnesota game. I think those are the two games that have the highest chances of popping off. But then I do, again, in terms of like single entry, I'll probably run like 5 or 6 single entry rosters. And I like the idea of like Joe Burrow. Because I like these Pittsburgh pieces. And you can probably do like a Joe Burrow game stack and just ignore the low point total of the game and say like there's a good chance that it exceeds its point total. And if it does exceed its point total, we probably know where those points are coming from for our DFS rosters. And then I'll probably have a Lamar Jackson team.
Yeah, of course. The Burrow and Pittsburgh one, it's like both really concentrated offenses, which is great. It's because like a lot of times you get in this position where it's like, oh, here's a game that could pop off. But then you not only need the game to pop off as like a lower likelihood game, but then you also have to get the players right because like a team that spreads the ball around. So it's like, we've talked on the show about the value of concentrated offenses. So if you're needing to get 2 bets right to get that 1 bet right, you need the game environment to go higher than expected, and then you need to pick the right players. Whereas in this spot, it's like, well, it's either like, without Jamar Chase, it's Hurst and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and Joe Mixon. That's the entire offense, right? They were 80% of Burrow's targeted passes went to those 4 guys last week. And so we know that's the entire offense. And then the Steelers, they got rid of Chase Claypool. So now it's, backfield, which we're probably not interested in. And then Freiermuth and Deontay and George Pickens. And so, I like that spot that if you get the game environment right, you probably know where to go to. And I'm with you. Like once you get past these top 3 game environments, you can look through the rest of them and it's really hard to paint a picture of any of these game environments blowing up, right? And so maybe no game environment blows up this week, but if one of them does, it's going to be one of those 3 higher total games. And definitely those are strong places to focus. I'll also note, you brought up not even needing to like stack Fields in a whole game environment. Mariota's over under for passing yards is 164.5. So like how challenging is it for him to bring like a pass catcher up with him if he's only throwing for 170, 180 yards? And so like Justin Fields with no bring back or Mariota with like David Montgomery, like that's the way that I see to kind of play that game, because then if you're rostering Mariota, you're saying that he gets a score like close to Fields, right? You're saying Fields doesn't get 30 plus. Otherwise, you would want to spend the extra salary on Fields. So then how does Fields not get 30 plus in a game where Mariota's scoring? Probably with Montgomery taking the touchdowns. Fields has the game that we talked about, like 80 rushing yards and 200 passing yards. He still gets them down there to the end zone, but the touchdowns flow through somebody else. And that's kind of the way that I see to approach that game is like, you stack it, but you kind of stack it pretty skinny because there's not going to be an overflow of players popping from that game, and then you focus a little bit more on these other ones.
There's one more game. We touched on it briefly. I want to bring it up because what about Jalen Hurts and Jonathan Taylor as a pairing? And hope that game goes over. And you've brought up some good arguments for against Jalen Hurts, I guess. Saying he's probably going to be overowned, like too expensive for the production. But it does seem like a spot that kind of fits in with this idea of taking like high upside players, rushing quarterbacks, and I don't think they're going to see as much ownership. Well, I guess we got Jalen Hurts at 16% ownership on FanDuel, but I don't know. I mean, that it does seem like two talented players that could elevate a game environment and elevate each other's scores.
I definitely won't argue against it, but I don't expect to have it. Does that make sense? Like it's one of those plays like, okay, not for me, but if somebody else is like, oh, but I really like this play, like it's not a play I want to talk somebody off of, because it definitely can hit. It's just one that I'm seeing as like a lower likelihood than the field will perceive, given like the way that the Colts defense is structured. And so it's one that I'll be off of, but I like if somebody played it, I would be like, oh, that's sharp. Like it's not a non-sharp way to go, especially because I think that pairing will be low owned and it tells a story about how this game could go off.
Okay. I guess any final thoughts? What's your one quarterback stack for the season?
Yeah, Josh Allen plus Stephon Diggs, and I agree with you. I think that the ownership will go up, and we already have Allen at 6.9% on OWS. I mean, it's not like he's going to be super low owned, but I do think that just with his price tag and these other guys available, I think that he's probably and how tight pricing is, I don't think that he's going to become like the chalkiest quarterback, right? I think that we'll get him kind of in this 7, 8, 9% range. So really like Josh Allen to Stephon Diggs. Expensive on a week with thin salary savings. And so I think we get low combinatorial ownership there and really set you up nicely in single entry.
Yeah. Before the show, I was like, guys, like I'm going to go with Josh Allen. But so maybe they'll be more popular then, but maybe not. And if so, that's great. And you don't know the ownership, right? You never know the ownership until you flip over the page and see once the games start. I'll go with Josh Allen and Nick Chubb because I think that'll be
a
unique pairing. I think you're going to see really low combined ownership on that. The only problem is you gotta plug it in and see what else you get. It costs a lot of salary, but I mean, I think tight end's a little bit of a wasteland. So we could, especially if Mark Andrews ends up sitting, so we could end up seeing some value at tight end, or just all tight ends will end up being value. So yeah, I'll go with that. Any closing thoughts?
No, I love that. I love the show. I like this week. I'm excited about this one. Excited to look back next week and see all the things that we got right and celebrate our windfall of money from the Week 11 slate.
Yeah, at the top of the leaderboard. All right,
there we go.
See you guys next week.